Have you ever had a dream to be a sardine? Look at them, all warm and cozy in their little can, their little tin houses. What if you could have a human-sized tin house for you to be all warm and cozy in? Like this. And you can even get one cheap. All you need to do is look for a port, find a container, get one off that fishy smelling boat, get a fishy smelling container, put it on a plot of land and live in it. And smell like a fish. Or you can buy a ready-made human scale box so you can live in a steel framed tin box for only $33,000. What a bargain. Nah, I'm just kidding. Container homes are actually really famous nowadays. They're starting to catch on. They're kind of trending. People are using them as alternatives for brick and mortar construction. Why? There are a few benefits, pros and cons that you can get from a container house that you can't get from a brick and mortar house. It's a constantly growing segment of real estate and relatively simple to implement. All you really need is to buy a container, insulate it, fill it with whatever you need, get a crane, plot it onto a plot of land, and you're done. No need to talk to contractors, builders, buy construction materials and all of this stuff. You can get a ready-made packet and live in it straight away. Of course, it's not all that simple, but let me explain how this works. Hi, my name is EvolveHumans, and if you're new to the channel, I talk about finance, real estate, and whatever related topics occur to me at the moment. So stay tuned if you want more content. So, what are container homes and how did they come to be? Containers are large steel-framed boxes, majoritarily, that are sturdy enough to be stacked one on top of the other and carry all sorts of goods, from chemical goods, furniture, toys, whatever someone needs to transport on a ship in large scale that weighs a lot because you transport it in bulk. They get a container, which will keep it safe during the long sea journey. Of course, as more countries started using containers and more countries started producing containers and more countries started producing containers, there was a huge stockpile of containers that were used that couldn't be used anymore for transport. Some containers have a 10-year warranty for use and then they have to be discarded. And there were huge scrap piles of container that no one was using. Someone one day had the bright idea of using it for a home. It's a reinforced structure that has a life period of 0 to 100 years sometimes, if they're maintained. And they have the perfect structure for building on top of if you want to make a home. That was the start of the container homes. It started around the mid-2000s, where people started repurposing containers for housing. There are a lot of insane projects. The sky is really the limit for container housing, because it's metal walls that you can stack on top of each other in whatever crazy design you have in your mind, and depending on your budget. Many builders and owners can combine multiple containers stacked on top of each other, or put windows on one side of the wall, the so-called three-walled containers, where you make a huge glass wall in front, and they can be very nice-looking homes. Very sturdy, nice-looking homes. Very resilient, nice-looking homes. So you can have a lot more variety than traditional brick-and-mortar houses. Now, what types of containers are there? This is very important, because there are some containers that are very unsuitable for human use. For example, most containers are the so-called dry standard containers, and there's also the high cube container, which is basically a dry standard container that is a bit taller, so you have an extra foot of headspace. Dry standard containers are those containers you see with the companies written on them. So whatever is transported on huge ships, usually you'll see a dry standard container. They're protected from sea, from heat, from destruction, they're sturdy, they can be stacked on top of, and that's what people use for transport. And they're also the cheapest to repurpose into a home. But they are sometimes not the best option. There's also the high cube container, as I already mentioned, which have at least a foot of extra headspace. So, when repurposing it for a house, the extra foot can be a big difference. Not that people are hunched over in containers, they're quite tall, but the extra foot of headspace is sometimes even a requirement to be able to build the container as a home. But more on that later. There is also a multi-purpose container called a reefer container. Reefer containers are usually used for transporting cold and perishable goods, because they're basically a giant fridge on its side. They can have refrigerators that can go from -25 to +25 degrees Celsius depending on your needs. But the good thing is they are also insulated. They insulate from heat and cold and whatever you need. They can come ready-made with insulation. The standard containers don't have insulation. They have to be installed later, which can be a bit of a pickle because corrugated steel doors and walls aren't really easy to change. Sometimes extensive works need to be made to insulate the tin box. Otherwise, if you live in a hot area, you can be cooked. The doors are also usually reinforced steel, so try breaking into that. You're basically living in a vault. And there is also a fourth option, among others, called the bulk. Bulk are containers that are usually used for stacking one on top of each other. They have little holes on top of them where you can put hooks in. So you can lift them up, stack them on top of another, and they'll fit straight in. They're used for stacking containers on top of each other, so making a 2-story home or 3-story home or a 20-story mansion, whatever you really want. Bulk can be useful for these sort of projects. Again, if you're thinking of a container home, you have to research into your climate and what is the best option for you. Of course, if you live in a cold space, if you live in a temperate climate, if you live wherever, there are so many different options for you for container living. It can really adapt anywhere. That's why you should do your research and not listen to a guy straight from the internet, because I'm not a professional. Definitely talk to a professional builder or a professional who builds containers and find out what is really right for you. Okay, that disclaimer is out of the way. They also usually come in 2 sizes, majoritarily. There's the 20-foot container, and then there's the 40-foot container. Since I live in Brazil, the measurements are in meters, so I'll put the conversions up here. For 20-foot containers, the length is 6.058 meters, the width is 2.438 meters, and the height is about 2.591 meters for the dry standard container. For the high cube container, the height is 2.896. You get that extra foot of headspace. For the 40-foot container, the length is 12.035 meters, and the width and the height are the same for both the dry standard and the high cube respectively. These are basically the 2 sizes of containers that you'll get. They don't really deviate much from this. So how do you buy a container? Where do you get them from? You just go to a port and say to the guy, I want a container. Want money? Give. More or less. You can buy used containers or ready-to-use containers. Used containers are usually containers that have hit their limit of around 10 years of commercial use, and they're being resold for some other purposes, such as housing purposes. These you have to be careful with. They're usually cheaper and the more eco-friendly option because you're reusing materials, but definitely check the condition. You need to look around the edges for rust, you need to look to see if the doors open and close and they close properly, if there's any dents, if there's any usage. You need to walk around the container and look very closely for these wears and tears, because after they're in your land and you're living in them, it's not a very good time to find these things out. There's also the very important thing of what they used to transport. If they transported highly radioactive chemical goods, I think that putting your family into one of these containers isn't a very good idea. Who knows if you might wake up with a third eye. There is also the matter of international certification. All, if not most, containers must have international certification to be accepted in ports, to be usable for transport. There are loads of international certifications that will make sure the containers are certified, that they're usable. If the seller doesn't give you the information of how long it's been in use, when it expired, how long its life period is, what it was used to transport, and etc., there are loads of other options, run away, because it's probably a dodgy seller. They need to have this certification to make sure that it's usable for other purposes. Some containers are also classified as one-trip containers. What this means is they transport goods once, usually coming from China. Most of them come from China. They transport goods once overseas and then are resold in the country they land in for other goods. These can be a good option because they're usually in good condition and cheaper because they're used. Okay, so you've got your container. You checked everything. You have the certification. Where can you build them? Well, first of all, you need land. And it needs to be kind of flat land. It's a good idea to have a plot and a plan of where you want to build these containers. Since they're rectangular, it's very easy to draw this up. Okay, now you need to see what your city limitations are. Every city, every state, they all have specific limitations to building. For example, over here, I can only build high cube containers because I need the extra headroom. Dry standard containers aren't suitable for living because they're too low in the city I'm going to build it in. So there are loads of little regulations that you should definitely check beforehand. Do your due diligence before buying a container, or you can have a nasty surprise. If you start building, you don't have a building permit, your land's not suitable, you don't have a foundation, whatever the city can make up to embargo your work, they can embargo it. Definitely check this before you start. And what are some of the downsides of container building? It's not all rainbows and lollipops and sunshine. Shipping containers can be very narrow. They can feel like you're in a box. They really can. Some people may not like this feeling of being closed in. This is why usually people knock down a wall and expand the container. Then it can feel like you actually have space. Of course, some options for this is to make a whole glass wall so you can open it and already be on the outside. And if you want to add extra rooms, the cost can start adding up. becoming almost as expensive, or if not even similar price to traditional brick and mortar housing. As I mentioned previously, the metal of the walls can make it hard to install insulation if it isn't previously built in. Traditional houses have wooden foundations where you can install insulation. Since it's a much more traditional way to build housing, insulation is ready-made for wooden housing and brick and mortar, not for containers. So you can rack up the price. If you need to get a specific contractor just for this, it can get expensive because it's not as widespread as traditional housing. Also, for multi-layer steel housing, you can require additional reinforcement depending on how much you want to put on top and the weight of all the stuff that's going to be in the container on top. Reinforcing is also kind of expensive depending on where you are. And definitely get air conditioning because the airflow through a container can sometimes be a bit tacky. So you need some way to refrigerate the container if you don't have a reefer, for example. There are little bits and bobs that can make it kind of hard and kind of a bother. Of course, choosing the right container is also a little bit different for first-time users, such as myself. I'll eventually film a video of installing my first container from scratch with absolutely no experience at all, so keep tuned for that. Are we helping the planet? Really helping the planet with using containers? Yes and no. Yes, because if you're reusing containers, it's junk that would otherwise be thrown out or just rust on a random beach somewhere, and you're using it, maintaining it, and using it to its full potential. Remember, containers can last many decades. However, reconstructing a container, knocking down steel walls, putting in insulation can produce more of a carbon footprint than a traditional house, or equal amounts, because you're constructing it just as you would a normal house. So it kind of defeats the purpose if that's it. However, you are using materials that are being left around to have a container house. You can also put solar panels. There are many other applications that you can do is reuse materials for containers because it sort of buys into the rustic look. So it is a sustainable option. Costs. The dosh. The dough. They are sometimes not cheaper than traditional brick and mortar housing, but you can get container homes that are much cheaper. For example, in the US, a smaller container can be $1,400 and a larger container, the 40-foot container, can be around $6,000. It's a lot of space for $6,000. You add in all the extra costs and all the building permits, the transport and all of that, it can get a bit high, depending on how you do. Of course, every single state, every single county, every single city is different. Usually portuary cities or cities that are closer to the coast can get cheaper values because the transport's way cheaper and you have way more option than if you live in the countryside. According to some sources, you could get a ready-made container home delivered and plotted for $33,000 US. A large container. So put that into perspective of the space you'll get compared to other housing. 40 feet for $33,000, ready-made in a shorter time. So these are all the pros and cons of container housing. Stay tuned for a future video where I'll be showing you how I bought a container and how I put it into a land with absolutely no experience. Of course, as always, if you like my content, like and subscribe and leave a comment down below, and I'll be all for this time. See ya!